Hi, welcome to episode 4 of Johnny Does .NET. My name is Johnny Hooijbergs, and in this series of videos I'm going to talk about my favorite programming platform, .NET. In today's episode I will talk about the .NET command line interface, Microsoft Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, and how these tools can help you to build your .NET applications. To start off, I would like to show you the .NET CLI, or how to use the .NET CLI on your operating system of choice. So as I told you in previous videos, .NET has the runtime and has the SDK, where the SDK can help you to build your .NET applications, and the runtime will of course run your .NET applications. So if you install the .NET SDK, the .NET command line interface is a part of that. And with the .NET command line interface, you can build and maintain and do whatever you want with your .NET applications as a developer on your platform without any need for additional tools. So you can do basically everything from the command line using the .NET CLI. So yeah, let's stop talking about it and just show you how it works. So if I open my terminal or console, I'm already inside of the johnnydoes.net folder, and here, if you have the SDK installed, you can use that .NET CLI command automatically. It should be available by just typing .NET. You can see there's not a lot of options here. You can, for example, display all the current .NET information by just typing .NET-info. I can get a lot of information from this, and as you can see, I am running .NET 6 on my operating system Windows. I can see where the .NET SDK is installed, but even I can see which SDKs I have installed next to each other. You can install multiple versions of the .NET SDK all next to each other. So I have the .NET Core SDK 3.1, I have the .NET 5 SDK in multiple versions, and I have the .NET 6 SDK in multiple versions. The reason that there's multiple versions of .NET SDKs, like multiple versions of 5 and multiple versions of 6, is because every now and then a new version of the major .NET release comes out to fix some issues, to fix some security issues if there are any. And that's the reason why we have these minor versions of version 6. As you can see, I have 4 different version 6 SDKs installed, and by default your .NET command line tool will use the latest one. You can customize which one is being used, but that is not really important for now. As I told you in a previous video, if you install the .NET SDK, you also get the .NET runtimes installed, because the .NET SDK is used to build and create applications. The .NET runtime is used to run your applications. And as you can see here, basically almost the same kinds of runtimes are installed next to the SDKs. I have version 3.1 of .NET Core, I have versions 5 and versions 6. The runtimes are split up in the runtimes for web applications, the runtimes for all additional .NET applications, and the runtimes for specific Windows desktop applications. So these last ones are desktop applications which are native to Windows, containing buttons and text boxes and stuff like that. So they are very specific to Windows and not really platform independent. But the web applications and all the other .NET applications are platform independent. Now, if I go back to my .NET command line interface, I could see that there's some additional options here. What additional options? Well, I can see by using the help command. So I can do .NET-H to give me a list of all the different kinds of commands I can use for creating and building and maintaining my .NET applications. Here, most of them speak for themselves. I have .NET build to build a new .NET project. So if I create a .NET project, I can build it to really get the executable file from that. I can clean an existing project, clean all of the binary files and start over. I can list all of my project references to other .NET projects, and I can do .NET New to create a new project. This is maybe an interesting one to start with, how to use .NET New to create a new .NET application based on a template. So if I want to do that, first I'm going to create a folder where inside of this folder I can create that project by using .NET New. So I'm going to do make directory test1 which already exists. So let's take test2, cd to test2. This is an empty folder. And inside of this empty folder, I'm going to create a new .NET application. So I'm just going to type .NET New because I don't really know how to use it. So this gives me a couple of options. It says you can use a template to create a new .NET project, and the templates are an ASP.NET Core web app, which is a web application, or a Blazor server app, which is also a web application, but a different kind of web application. I can create a class library, which is a DLL class library, which you can use in multiple projects, which you can reuse in multiple projects. There's the console application that can run from the console or from the terminal. And then there's the Windows Forms app and the WPF application, which are those Windows specific UI designed applications. Just to keep things easy, I'm going to show you how to use the .NET New command for console applications. So I can do .NET New console by just using that short name console from here, right here. So I do this. It will create all of the necessary files based on that console template. And if I list the directory information, I can see that there's now a couple of files being created for me. There's the program.cs source code file, and then there's the test2 CS project file. So there's a project file and there's a source code file. Now, in order to run this application, I need to compile it down to the intermediate language, and then I need to use the runtime to run my application and see the actual result. So the .NET CLI also has this build command to build the current project within the current directory. So I'm just going to do .NET build. And if I wait very patiently and see that I have 0 warnings and 0 errors, I can list the directory info, and I can see that there's an additional folder being created. It's the binary folder, the bin folder. So I can look inside of this bin folder, and I can see that inside of this bin folder, I have a debug folder. So this is actually the default configuration for building your application into some kind of debug mode. And this debug mode has some additional information for you to debug your applications. When something goes wrong while running your applications, you can have some additional information on why it went wrong. So this is very handy. If you want to create like an actual version of your software that you want to ship to your customers or to your users, you of course need to use a different kind of configuration profile, which is the release configuration profile, which has not all of these additional information, which makes it a little bit smaller and easier to use for your customers. But for now, we will just look at that debug configuration. Inside of this folder, you can see there's a .NET 6 folder because I'm targeting .NET 6 with this application. You can actually have one single application targeting multiple runtimes at the same time if you want. But for now, we'll just keep the .NET 6 version, which is the only one that I'm targeting right now. And inside of this folder, you have all of those files that I talked about in my previous video. Right? You have the DLL file, you have the executable file. The DLL file is the one that really contains all of your custom code being compiled down into that intermediate language. And then we use the .NET runtime to interpret that intermediate language to just-in-time compile it into machine code and to run it on your machine. But to make things easier for us, we also have that Bootstrapper Executable that will do all of those steps for us. So the executable file is the one we use on Windows to actually run our application. It will start the .NET runtime, it then will load that DLL file into that runtime, and so on and so forth. So in order to run this application, I can go ahead and run the test2.exe. No, that's the wrong one, sorry, test2.exe. And it says hello world. So let's do that again without me messing up. So I'm running test2, it says hello world, and it immediately stops running. So this is the default template for a console application. It creates that hello world message by default. So let's go back to my root directory for my project, which should be this one. Yes, it is. That's weird. Okay. That's this one. And I can show you some other stuff. If I go back to .NET-H, I can see that there's also a run command, which is actually some kind of shortcut. Instead of building your application and then going into the bin debug in .NET 6 directory, you can immediately run it from the root directory, and then it will get compiled and ran for you at the same time. So it's much easier if you're trying to test some things that you are changing very rapidly in your application. So instead of building, I can just do .NET Run, and it will immediately compile and run your application from here. And I don't need to do any additional steps, which is quite handy. So for example, if I go to Notepad, and inside of Notepad, I open my source code file, program.cs, and I make a change. Let's say hello world becomes hello YouTube. I save, I go back to my terminal, do .NET Run. Now it will recompile and it will run my new version of my application saying hello YouTube, which is very cool. Now I'm using Notepad to make changes to my source code. It actually, with the .NET CLI, doesn't really matter which text editor you are using to change your source code files. Basically, the text editor you like most, which is very flexible. The .NET CLI runs on multiple operating systems. It runs on Windows, it runs on Linux, it runs on Mac, and you are completely free to use whichever editor you need to make changes to your source files, which is very powerful. But something that is also very powerful is that I even have some additional commands for .NET. Let's say, for example, I do something like let me first change this code a little bit. Let me just remove everything from my source code file and just declare a variable I, which is 0, which is a number, and then create an infinite loop while doing while true. While true will run indefinitely. I'm going to increase the value of I with 1. So it's just a number that's going to be increased with 1 in an unending loop. And then I'm going to console write line the value of I to the console. So this will convert the number I into a string that has that number I, and it will output it to the console. In order to make it a little bit slower, instead of just going full force on all of those numbers, because when your computer does a while true, it goes very, very quickly, I'm just going to do a task delay of 1000 milliseconds. So it will basically give me a number each second. So let's try if this works and if I did not make any mistakes. So .NET Run becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So this will keep going indefinitely. Every second it will throw me a number, an increasing number, which is very cool. Okay, now I can show you the .NET Watch command, which is basically the same as .NET Run, but while your application is running, it will watch all the source code files. And whenever a source code file changes, it will automatically include those changes in the running process, which is quite a powerful feature. So let's go back to my code. Let's drag it a little bit off to the right-hand side and just add some dashes before and after my number. Now, when I save this file by pressing Ctrl S on my keyboard, the .NET Watch will see the file change. It will compile the file into a new binary file, and then it will incorporate it in the running process. And automatically my program now, it did not stop running, it keeps on going, but it has those changes that I made as part of my running application, which is a very cool feature. So if you really want to do some trial and error coding, you can just put your notepad on the left hand side, put your terminal on the right hand side, or the other way around, and you can keep making these little changes. Let's change those minuses in pluses, save changes, and immediately you can see those changes in your console, which is very cool. Now, to prove to you that you've you've got this SDK command line interface experience on Windows, you can have the same experience on Linux. So I have a Linux prepared that also has that .NET SDK installed. So if I open my terminal and I do .NET, I have the exact same experience. I can do .NET --info to get all of the info on my running environment. In this case, it's a Ubuntu 20.04 operating system. I only have the .NET 6 SDK installed, which has its web runtime and additional runtime installed. I can do the same thing with the -h for my help function. I can see I have the same commands. So I can also do create a directory with the name test, let's say 99. I can do cd to this new directory. This directory is empty. So ls, this directory is empty, and I can do .NET new console to create the same kind of console application within this directory. If I do ls one more time, you can see that now I have indeed those same files, the object directory and then the program source code file and the test99 C# project file. Again, I can open a text editor in Linux. I can open my file from sources test99 program.cs, and I can do the same thing. I can do the declare a variable, assign it 0. I can do the while infinite loop, something like that. I can do the await task.delay of 1000 milliseconds. I can do increment of I like this. And I can output by using the console write line where I want to output the I variable. Something like this. So if I go back to the terminal, I can use .NET Run to run my application, and hopefully I did not make any mistakes here. Yes, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So it works the exact same way. Additionally, of course, we also have that .NET Watch command available. There we go. It compiled. It started to watch. It looks at those files on the file system, and if there is a change within those files, we should see that change. So let's do the same thing. Let's drag my text editor to the side here and do something different. Let's instead of showing I, let's show I squared and save this file. It recompiles, and now we can see I squared instead of I. So it's now 576, 625, 676, 729, and so on. So we have basically the same experiences on both operating systems. So finally, really a platform independent version of .NET. And this actually makes me very happy that we as a developer have this flexibility of just using the command line interface to help us create new applications, build existing applications, make changes to applications, watch running applications, change while we change source files, and so on. We have the flexibility to use the text editor that we want instead of the one that Microsoft tells us to use, which is great. Now, the .NET CLI is very flexible for us to use, but of course, it all goes manually. So we need to do all of these things manually. We have to know the commands, we have to learn the commands, and we have to use a text editor that is maybe not always helpful in writing the source code with us. Now, there are some additional tools you can use, and I'm going to talk about two of them, Microsoft Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. But first, let's start with Microsoft Visual Studio. So Microsoft Visual Studio is already quite an old product from Microsoft, and with old I mean it already runs for many years. It is even a little bit older than .NET itself. It is actually being used to create a whole range of different kinds of applications for different kinds of platforms, for different kinds of programming languages. But .NET is also a huge part of the Microsoft Visual Studio tool, and we can really leverage Microsoft Visual Studio to easily create these applications. So let me just show you what Visual Studio looks like and how you can use it to do the same thing as we did before with the Microsoft command line interface. or the .NET command line interface. So let's open Visual Studio. There we go. So when you open Visual Studio, you can see that I have version 2022 installed, which is the latest version today. Every couple of years, there's a new major release of Visual Studio. And from this window, I can open my recent projects, but I can also open existing project from somewhere else, or I can create a new project, just like we could with the .NET CLI. So when I create a new project, I just have this list of templates, just like with the .NET New command line tool. But here I have a little bit more information about what kind of project is this. So I can immediately see there's a console application here, but I can also see that we are using the C# programming language to do that. We can see that it's a platform independent console app because it runs on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. And there's some additional other templates like the Blazor server app for the web applications that are using Blazor. You can have filters, you can search for templates, you can create your own templates if you want. You can change your programming language, you can change the platform you are targeting, and you can change your project types. So you have a lot more flexibility and helpful features to search for the exact template that you need for your application needs. When I choose a template, so in this case, I'm going to choose the console app like we did before from the CLI, you can click next and you will go through a wizard that will help you step-by-step configuring your project. For a console app, there's not a lot of configuring, but we of course also have to choose where to put it. So I'm going to put it in the same directory as before, and I'm also going to call it test1, just like before. I removed the previous folder already, so I can just name it in the same way. I press next. I choose which version of the .NET platform I want to use. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick the latest .NET 6 version, which is the long-term support version today, and click Create. Because Visual Studio is quite a large application that contains lots of helpful features, it takes a while to load. Of course, when you really want things to go very snappy, you can always go back and use the .NET CLI to do this work for you. Now, I still have to be a little bit patient here to make Visual Studio load everything. But this is my source code file, program.cs, loaded for me automatically. And on the right-hand side, I have a Solution Explorer, which basically shows me all of the files within my project. So these are the files that will be created in that directory you choose. With .NET New Console, we did the same thing. We had that program.cs file generated for us in that directory, and we also had the C# project file created. Now, the project file is not really visible here. It is, but not in the same way. We don't see the file itself. We see this test1 project entry within this tree list. Now, when I want to see the file, I can just double click this and it will open that CS project file that we've seen on disk before, and where we can change some project properties. But in Visual Studio, they've hidden it behind this project node inside of this solution tree. So this is my project, which I can collapse or extend, and inside of my project, there is my source code file. If I want to test and run this application, I don't need to go to a command line interface. I can just run it from Visual Studio by clicking the play button in the top, and it will run my application on the current platform, and it will open the console for me, telling me hello world, because that is of course the code that is being run. And then it will tell me that the application stopped, and I can press any key to close this window. Now, I'm going to do the exact same thing as before, but just show you from Visual Studio. So I'm just going to delete all of that code, and I'm going to declare a variable called I equals 0. So I'm going to declare a variable called I, and I'm going to assign it 0. And immediately you can see some colors popping up. I can see int, which is a type, which is dark blue. Then I can see the variable I, which is some sort of gray, and then I can see the value 0 being assigned to it. I can also see weird squiggly lines underneath the I, which tells me the variable I is assigned, but its value is never used, which is Visual Studio trying to be a smartass. It's telling me you have created a variable I, you have assigned it a value, but you're never using it. which is true, which is not a very smart thing to do. But of course, I'm in the process of building my application. So be very patient, Visual Studio. I will fix this in just a minute. I'm going to do a loop, and as you can see, Visual Studio is trying to be very smart about this. Visual Studio thinks, I think you are trying to do a loop, and he suggests to me to do a for loop. But I'm going to be a little bit weird about it. No, Visual Studio, I'm going to do a while loop. So I'm going to do while true. And you can see some additional colors here. You can see that the while is a little bit in purple because that is a keyword. The int is a type. So a type is blue and a keyword is purple and so on. Now, in order to do the same thing, I'm just also going to add the await task.delay. But you can see here that Visual Studio is trying to do some additional helping. I was just typing task, and Visual Studio was already giving me a list of all the options that are available from that task class. And so the task class is part of that .NET base class library, and it has a couple of functions, or it has a whole list of functions that I, as a developer, can use. And Visual Studio just shows me these are all of your options. And while you are typing, it will filter that list. So I just type the letter D, and the only option available, the only function available is delay that starts with a D. But there's others. As you can see, there's also when all or when any. So when I type W, I can see all of the functions that start with the W, which is very handy. And this is actually where your learning as a developer should really start. You can learn lots from this by just typing a class, see what functions are available, and then just look at the name of those functions to learn, okay, what can I do? What functionality is available to me as a developer by just reading through all of those function names, because those function names really make sense and you can learn what they actually do by just looking at their names. But now I just want to use the delay function, and you can see that immediately I get some more information about what parameters I can supply to this delay function. You can see that there's an integer, a number of milliseconds that I want to delay, and this how I was using it before. So 1000 milliseconds is 1 second, but I can also see that it also expects a time span object, and a time span object is some other way to deal with how much time goes by. So if I just do time span, I can see a whole list of time span from seconds, from days, from hours. Oh, this is very interesting. I can make my code a little bit more readable. Instead of putting 1000, which doesn't really says it's 1000 milliseconds, if you know the function from your heart, you know that it's in milliseconds, but you don't see it from the code immediately. This way, if I do timespan.from seconds and I specify 1 second, this is very clear. If you read this for the first time, you can see that I will delay for a time span that is being calculated from an amount of seconds where the amount equals 1. So 1 second delay. So of course, it's a lot of text to do a very simple thing, but it's very clear immediately. In my next step, I'm going to do I++ to increment I with 1. And then on my next rule, I'm just going to output by using console.writeLine. And again, you can see Visual Studio is trying to be smart. He's thinking, oh, you want to write something to the console. And he looks at the context of your application. You have declared a variable I. You have changed the value of this variable I. So I guess you want to write it to the console, don't you? Yes, I want to do that, but in a slightly different way. Doesn't really matter. I can use tab to autocomplete this line of code, making me a very snappy developer. And then I can change this part of that code to $, and then output the number I, just like this. Very cool. So you can already see that Visual Studio adds a lot to the experience. You don't need to use Notepad and have no help whatsoever. You can use Visual Studio. It will help you, guide you through the .NET Base Class Library and all of the functions that you can use. It will help you with warnings and exceptions and errors if there are any. By the way, you can see that the I is now just normal black. It's not gray anymore because Visual Studio now sees that indeed we are changing the value of I and we are outputting the value of I, which makes sense and now is completely fine. Let's start the application again, see what happens. And it works 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So it runs indefinitely, just showing the increment of numbers. Now, can I do the same thing as before? Can I make a change to my code and then, for example, add the dash in front and behind? So I'm saving my file, save, opening my console, and you can see that immediately it starts outputting the changes. So it works from Visual Studio also. Very cool. So the .NET Watch function works from the command line, but it also works from Visual Studio. Perfect. Actually, when we stop the application, you can see that there's the play button to start the application, and then there's that little fire icon that says hot reload. This is actually the replacement for that .NET Watch in Visual Studio. So when I start my application, that button becomes available. I have to be a little bit patient. So this is my application running. So the hot reload button says to hot reload on file save. This is what happens from the .NET Watch also. I can actually turn this off. And then when I make a change, plus, and save that file, you can see that now these changes are not happening automatically. So this is cool. In Visual Studio, I can already change the behavior of that .NET Watch function. I can click this button to hot reload only when I want to, and not every time I save my file. So if I press this button and then look again, you can now see that the change has actually happened. So you have more options here. You can indeed enable or disable this automatic hot reload on save. So I'm not going to go into much more detail for Visual Studio right now. I just showed you how to use Visual Studio for the same kind of application that we did before with the .NET command line interface. But in later episodes where I talk about more templates and where I talk about the C# language in more details, I will also talk about Visual Studio more, and I will explain to you all of the different functions and actions you can use from Visual Studio. So I talked about the .NET command line interface, which gives you all of the flexibility to do it exactly like you want it. You can use the command lines and commands to do all of the functions. You can use the text editor you really like to use to write your code. But I've also shown you Visual Studio, which really helps you a lot while writing your code. It has much more templates. It shows you more information about those templates, and it has all of that functionality inside of its text editor to really help you write code. But of course, these are two extremes. You have the extreme flexibility, but not a lot of help while writing your application. And then you have that full-blown Visual Studio experience that all the way helps you while writing your applications. But maybe you want something more snappy and you already know what you are doing, so you want less help maybe, but you just want to have a very quick experience. Now there's multiple tools you can use, but one additional tool also created by Microsoft is Visual Studio Code. The name is almost the same as Visual Studio. So there's Microsoft Visual Studio and then there's Visual Studio Code. And Visual Studio Code is just a text editor, but it is a text editor with a lot of support for extensions. And with those extensions, you can actually customize your own experience, and you can add as many or as little extensions as you want to make it a very flexible experience that is as flexible as the .NET CLI, but not as fully loaded as Microsoft Visual Studio. So let's just take a look at what Visual Studio Code looks like. So let me quickly find a Visual Studio Code and close the current workspace. There we go. So Visual Studio Code is just a text editor. It is a text editor with some additional features. So you basically use it as a text editor for your files. And by the use of extensions, you can have as much functionality included with this application as you want. So you can see that I already have a lot of extensions installed. There's simple extensions like the .NET Purple theme. The .NET theme is always purple. The logo from .NET is purple. So I decided I want my Visual Studio Code user interface to also be the same purple. So this is a very simple and very UI specific extension. But you also have the C# extension. And the C# extension is used to help you write C# code just like Visual Studio does. So it will help you with pop-ups and autocompletes and show you what you are doing right and what you are doing wrong, which is a very powerful tool. And then there's even more additional extensions to use when you are doing cloud development and stuff like that. I'm not going to in too much detail about that. Let's just do the same thing as before, but now from Visual Studio Code. There's a couple of options here. You can still use Visual Studio Code next to the .NET CLI. So I can do cd e temp and then johnny.net. Let's see. There's the test1 folder I created earlier. So let's make a test2 folder then. So cd test2, which is an empty directory, which is perfect. So I'm going to use the .NET New command line to generate the files for me as part of that template. And then I'm going to edit those files using Visual Studio Code. So I do .NET New console. It will generate that program.cs file and that C# project file, which are right here. And then I'm going to edit those files using Visual Studio Code. You can do it in multiple ways. You can do from Visual Studio Code, open the file, but you can also open the folder. So if I open the folder, and of course I need to find the folder. So many folders on my system here. So temp, then there's johnny.net and test2. So this is the folder I want to open. There you go. You have an explorer just like in Visual Studio, but this is more file-based. In Visual Studio, it's really project and solution-based. This is file-based. So now I have my test folder, which has the bin and the object folders inside. Visual Studio asks me to make sure that I'll be able to build all of these things into a .NET application. So I'm just going to go ahead and say yes. It will generate additional files to write down the configuration to do that. You don't really need to care about that for now. And then I can just click on these files to open them and to actually edit them. And you can also see that there's some coloring here, some extra information about the classes and the functions that you are using. So it's a bit like Visual Studio, but it's not as extensive. But this is more helpful when writing C# code. So I can do the same thing again. I can do int I equals 0, and you have somewhat the same coloring here. You have the same warnings. Local variable I is assigned, but its value is never used. So it's the same helpful features, but more on a file-based system. And it is much more snappy than Visual Studio. So let's also do that while true loop. And then the await task dot delay. You can see the same functionality basically. I can do D and I can see that there's the delay function. When I open, I can see that it expects a number of milliseconds with the additional information, but I can also browse all the other options like time span. So let's do the time span again. Time span from seconds, 1 second. Increment I with 1, and then do a console write line. By the way, I didn't tell you this before, but if you want to do write line, W shows you things like window height, window top, right, and write line, set window position. So the W doesn't really need to be the first letter. It can also be a letter from another word. So if I want to do write line, I can actually type WL, which is write line or window left. See? So I can do the first letter of each word for my function that I'm trying to call, and then just press the enter key to autocomplete that word. So less typing for me as a developer is quicker application development. So I'm going to output the same I value as I did before. Now in Visual Studio Code, with installing that C# extension, you get this kinds of helpful functions. And then you can choose, if you want to run this application, you can do it in different ways. You can, for example, do view and then terminal, which opens an integrated terminal within Visual Studio. And you can do your PowerShell or terminal functionality right in the same window. So you don't have to switch between those applications on your system or have multiple monitors that do that. You can just do it from within Visual Studio Code. So if I want to test this, I can do Dotnet Run from here, because it automatically opens the folder where my project here is located, and it will start running my application just as you would do it before. If you, of course, want to have that same functionality with Dotnet Watch, you can do Dotnet Watch from here, just like that. And then you can start making changes to your code. Let's do I to the power of 3. Save. Dotnet Watch sees the change, compiles the change, and there we go. So that's Visual Studio Code for you. It is a lot more simple than Visual Studio. It is also free. I did not yet talk about this, but it's a free tool for you to use. And it's platform independent, just like .NET is. Visual Studio, the full-blown application, is not platform independent. It only works on Windows. There is a very specific version for macOS, but there is no version for Linux. So it's not really platform independent, where Visual Studio Code is fully platform independent, and it's also available on Linux and on macOS. There is also debug functionality here with the run start debugging, but I will show you this in a future video. And with that, we reach the end of this episode, where I've shown you how to use the .NET command line interface and tools like Microsoft Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code to build and maintain your applications. In the next episode, I will go a little bit deeper into the different kinds of templates and workflows you can use to create different kinds of applications, going from web applications to desktop applications to mobile applications and much more. Did you like this video? Don't forget to give me a thumbs up, and if you like to be notified of future videos, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and see you next week.